Good to be doing this at home right here in Central Ohio. Love to see you guys out here.
This is great. To be at the bleeding edge of the country, we have to start at the center of the country. That's where we are, right here at home. And I want to say how proud I am of, Paul gave me a short tour beforehand. We're going to be continuing to tour this facility after of what you all have done here at Axiom. Congratulations for being a crown jewel, an embodiment of what is possible in the United States of America, supplying the greatest companies in the world at a faster pace than what even they will get from China. That's what today's actually about. This campaign, for those of you who have been following it, you know this. This is about filling the void at the heart of our country. We're in the middle of a national identity crisis today. We have forgotten what it means to be an American. I am 38 years old. I'm the youngest person ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. Thank you. I appreciate that. Born and raised in Ohio, the kid of immigrants who came here with almost no money, founded multi-billion-dollar companies, did it while marrying my wife, who would have been here except she's doing surgeries at Ohio State right now, raising our two sons here in Columbus, Ohio, following our faith in God. That's the American dream. I am genuinely worried that that American dream will not exist for our two sons and their generation unless we all step up and do something about it. We're in the middle of a national identity crisis where we have to answer that question of what does it even mean to be an American today? You ask people my age that question, you get a blank stare in response. That is the vacuum. That is the void. And I've talked in other settings about the revival of core American ideals, meritocracy, the pursuit of excellence, free speech and open debate, self-governance over aristocracy. I think 80% of people in this country easily agree on those basic ideals. Half the 20 are people younger than me who never learned those ideals in the first place. And we're going to bring them along too. That is how we're going to reunite this country. But one of the most important ways we're actually going to do it is by reviving a national pride that's real. It's not a fake national pride with eagles and red, white, and blue. It's grounded in reality, in economic prosperity here at home, in a modern Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson would have signed and did sign in 1776, that he would sign if he were alive today, is what we're going to talk about today, our Declaration of Independence from China. There are 5 key elements to this campaign. One is to shut down the unconstitutional administrative state. Second is to shut down those federal regulations in a way that grows our economy, again, in the United States of America. And last week I gave a speech at the America First Policy Institute to lay out exactly how we were going to get that job done. But the other elements to our vision for this country are to avoid World War III, declare economic independence from our enemy, and to revive national pride in this country. That's really what we're going to talk about. Our domestic policies and our foreign policies, these are two sides of the same coin. Even when it comes to foreign policy, I believe in clarity. Avoid World War III, declare independence from our enemy, and rebuild our actual homeland security defenses that we're missing. Next month, I'm going to give a speech on exactly how we will defend the homeland, but today is really the centerpiece of both a domestic policy vision and a foreign policy vision of how we no longer depend on our enemy for the shoes on our feet to the phones in our pockets. And I'll start with the story of where this began. It actually began with a good decision we made in 1972, when Nixon made a decision that he had to make that was the right decision in his time when we were in the middle of the Cold War with the USSR. What did he do? He made the decision to reopen trade relations with China. And it's really important to understand the history of how we got here if we're going to find our path forward. What happened was the USSR was our main adversary in the Cold War. And Nixon recognized then, as I think we ought to recognize today, that the alliance between China and Russia was the single greatest threat to U.S. military might in the Cold War. So he made an unconventional decision. We didn't trust Mao Zedong, but we trusted him to follow his self-interest. And Nixon did a deal with Mao that nobody else believed was possible, to say we were going to reopen relations with China as a condition for pulling them away from the USSR. And that was one of the pivotal events that 20 years later led us to the end of the Cold War. It's worth recognizing that even the mistakes that we make often begin with decisions that were the right decisions at the time they were made. But then we had a bipartisan consensus in this country that took that vision in the wrong direction. In the 1990s, we had a bipartisan consensus in the United States of America around a philosophy known as democratic capitalism in the U.S. This was a new movement. Not putting this today is not a partisan speech. It's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's an honest American reflection. A bipartisan consensus in the 1990s that we would then take the further step of admitting China to the World Trade Organization and to adopt the wish that we were going to use capitalism as a vehicle to spread democracy to places like China. That we were going to export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to export our values to the CCP. Well, that's where we lost the plot. China realized they could actually play that game in reverse. We thought we could use our money, trade with China to get them to be more like us. What they realized is that they could use access to their market, their money, to get us to be more like them. Or one step worse than that, that they could use our money to get us to be more like them. So if you have any doubt about this, I'm going to walk you through how deep this plot runs. Xi Jinping, when he is pressed by the UN or other bodies on the human rights crisis in Xinjiang, where there are over 1 million Uyghurs enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse, in what is one of the worst human rights atrocities committed by a major nation since the Third Reich of Germany. What does he say? Well, the U.S. is no better, he says, because Black Lives Matter, BLM, proves that the U.S. is no better on human rights. Their top diplomat, Yang Jiechi, came to the Alaska summit in the last couple of years, where he looked Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, in the eye with an opening speech where he said, China wants to see the U.S. do better on human rights and to stop slaughtering, that's his word, stop slaughtering black Americans. Now, this would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own companies in the United States of America lend implicit credibility to those claims. Take Nike, reflecting on the sins of slavery 250 years ago in the United States, without saying a peep about its reliance on China and actual slave labor today to sell $250 sneakers to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. Can't have it both ways. Now Nike says it is a company. John Donahoe, the CEO, his words, not mine, a company of China for China. Take Disney. 2 years ago has no problem eviscerating a anti-abortion bill in the state of Georgia or a parental rights bill in the state of Florida, while just 2 years ago going to Xinjiang, literally ground zero of that human rights crisis, to film Mulan without saying a peep until the very end of the movie. And you can see it at the end of the credits today that says, we thank the local authorities for allowing us the privilege of filming here. Our fellow Ohioan, former Ohioan at least, LeBron James, who famously derided Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Human Rockets, for daring to say, fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong. Nike, BlackRock, Airbnb, JP Morgan Chase. The story is the same because it's not even their fault. It comes down to money. The Chinese Communist Party builds a great Chinese wall that stops you from entering the Chinese market if you criticize the CCP. But they will roll out the red carpet if you criticize the United States. Take BlackRock, the first asset manager ever to be granted as a foreign asset manager the right to sell mutual funds in China. How did they get it? It was only after BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, lobbied in the United States for lowered listing standards for Chinese companies in the U.S. Now, is it any mystery that the same company that tells U.S. firms like Exxon and Chevron and countless other companies that they have to reduce emissions, including Scope 3 emissions here in the United States, does not say a peep as a shareholder of PetroChina on the other side of the world, even as they apply no emissions caps on the other side. This is not an accident, and it's exactly what happens in the United States when we are dependent on our adversary for our modern way of life. We sang the siren song of saying that this was actually about global capitalism, that we're committed to capitalism. And make no mistake, I am an unapologetic defender of capitalism, true capitalism, as the best system known to man to lift us up from poverty. That is the American way of life. That is the story of Axiom Plastics. That is the story of the American dream that so many of us have lived. But when that system is co-opted by a foreign actor to use capitalism as a vehicle to advance non-economic agendas, that's not capitalism anymore. That is mercantilism. And the right answer for the 21st century is not the same answer that we might have given back in 1980. I respect Ronald Reagan. I respect him because, like Nixon, he did what he needed to do in his era. He slashed regulations, opened up trade, embraced global capitalism at a time when that was what was required. But as my favorite Republican president of all time, Abraham Lincoln, famously said it, the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And today we say that the dogmas of 1980 are inadequate to the unique challenges that we as Americans face today. And what I'm going to lay out today, we're sort of making this a trademark of the campaign. We like to use some poster boards to make things clear. What we're going to lay out is, for the first time in either party, a clear and pragmatic vision for how we will actually, finally, at long last, declare economic independence from China while actually advancing American prosperity here at home. This isn't a wish list. This is what we are actually going to get done in this country. There's 4 elements to it. First is to declare independence from China. We must declare independence from the climate agenda here at home. Second, to declare independence from China over the long run, we must first ensure we have semiconductor independence from Taiwan starting today here at home. Thank you. Third, we will declare independence for our defense industrial base so that the weapons that we may need, God forbid, in an armed conflict scenario with China, do not actually come from China. And fourth, a pharmaceutical supply chain that we rely on for life-saving medicines to daily medicines like ibuprofen that we take that rely on our enemy for our modern way of life. We will cut off our pharmaceutical dependence on China. Those are the 4 elements of how we will at long last in this country declare economic independence from our enemy. Let me start with the first of those articles, the Articles of Independence from Communist China. We have to actually declare independence from the climate change agenda, which is itself a farce. I said this on the debate stage. I took a lot of heat for it. I'm going to say it again. The climate change agenda is a hoax because it has nothing to do with the climate and everything to do with global equity, specifically letting China catch up to the United States of America economically. I'll explain to you how it works by way of example. Take the electric vehicle cult in the United States, and I have no problem with the existence and purchase of electric vehicles, but I do have a problem with a subsidized industry that falsely tilts the scales towards China. Those EVs, we depend on them. We depend on China for rare earth minerals and mineral refining capacity in order to provide those electric vehicles in the United States. So when U.S. taxpayers subsidize EVs, we are actually subsidizing the Chinese Communist Party on whom we rely for the production of those EVs. The same story for the solar panels in this country. Think about the emissions caps that we apply in this country. As of 2019, and the trend continues, China emits more carbon, more greenhouse gas emissions than the United States and the rest of the developed world combined by claiming to be a developing nation under the Paris Climate Accords and other international standards. Yes, that is a farce. The same opponents to carbon emissions, projects from companies like Chevron that are dropped, say nothing, as those same carbon emissions are shifted to places like China. Yes, that is a farce. The same opponents to carbon emissions here at home are also opponents to the greatest form of carbon-free energy production known to mankind in the United States of America. That is nuclear energy, where China is the only country, other than the U.S., that has a Gen 4 reactor today, while we still suffer with Gen 2 reactors. And so what we're going to have to do in the United States is actually reduce our dependence on China by first unshackling ourselves from the climate agenda here at home with a commitment to once again, without restraint, drill, frack, burn coal, and embrace nuclear energy in this country. And what I will do as U.S. President is on day one, we will rescind any unconstitutional federal regulation from the EPA to the Department of Energy to the SEC that requires even the measurement or the reporting of carbon dioxide emissions. We are done with it, to instead focus on GDP growth and actual American flourishing here at home. That is what we will focus on measuring, and that is the first step to declaring independence from an enemy that is purposefully using an agenda to shackle the United States as they continue to catch up by the day. It's not too late to get this right. We're behind, but that's the first step to our economic independence from China. The second step is critical. It requires regaining control over our modern way of life, and there's a special reason why we're giving this speech here today, just a 5 to 10 minute drive from the new facility being built by Intel right here in Ohio. That comes to declaring our semiconductor independence from Taiwan. I want to tell you all how serious this is. Today we depend on Taiwan for the little chips that power our modern way of life. From these phones in our pockets, to those lights, to those cameras, to the refrigerators that kept your water cold before you drank it this morning. Those are powered by these little chips, leading edge semiconductors, manufactured and powered by Taiwan. The fact that we ever got here, the fact that our entire modern way of life depended on a set of islands off the southeast coast of China, is a shame. We must learn from our past or we're destined to make the same mistakes again. But we are where we are. And so now the question is, with precision, how do we actually address it? What I'm about to lay out is not an economically protectionist vision. We have to be precise. We believe in capitalism in the United States. We don't believe in crony capitalism. There could be many reasons for showering money from on high like manna from heaven, from the government onto companies. I think we have to be clear-headed about why we're actually doing it. And I think this is where I part ways with the current administration, the Biden administration, as well as many Republicans who supported the CHIPS Act. This is difficult for me to say here in Ohio, but I believe in speaking truth. That is what this campaign is all about, speaking the truth, not just when it is easy, but when it is hard. I am opposed to the CHIPS Act because it is really the Green New Deal masquerading in CHIPS masquerade clothing. Listen to what Gina Raimondo has said in boasting about that act. Child care requirements for companies. I mean, I love child care, but the government shouldn't be foisting that onto a select group of companies in their supply chains as a condition for getting federal money. An ESG agenda, diversity quotas, up and down a supply chain supposedly in the name of onshoring semiconductor production into this country. The same act that passed the CHIPS Act into law was the same law. Literally, if you had to sign up for CHIPS, you also had to sign up for the National Science Foundation, the NSF, applying diversity, equity, inclusion quotas and mandates to how they make their grants based on race through the National Science Foundation. I reject that, and we deserve a president who will do the right thing but without having the wrong thing tethered to it. And that's why even here in Ohio, I will say that the CHIPS Act was the wrong way to go, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater either. Not for economically protectionist reasons, but for national security reasons. It is important that we have a narrowly tailored focus on bringing back semiconductor production here to the United States of America. And it's not just about money. The number one impediment to TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, building out its new plant in Arizona, it's not the money. It is the absence of skilled workers and trained workers who can actually know how to produce those semiconductors in Arizona. You mark my words, that will be the number one rate limiting factor here in Ohio as well, which is why we need to focus on actual workforce training in the United States, not subsidizing four-year gender studies majors in California, but actually people will go through vocational training and skills-based training to fill the actual needs we have in the United States. That's actually a vital objective. It's easy to sign a $50 billion crony capitalist boondoggle with DEI and ESG all over it. That's the easy part. The hard part is doing what's actually required to fill that supply chain. So what we need is a narrowly tailored focus and policy that narrowly accomplishes the semiconductor gap that we face in this country while being disciplined as we do it. How do we ensure that discipline? If we're serious about declaring economic independence from China, I will challenge my fellow conservatives on this one. Anybody who is actually serious, not about paying lip service to this, not about talking about a wish list to onshore to the United States, which is my first best option too, but if we're really serious about cutting off our economic dependence on our enemy, China, then we have to be serious about a trade-friendly approach with our allies to also get there. That means reopening and expanding trade relationships with our friends in the likes of Japan and South Korea, and opening market access to the United States for those providers of semiconductors as well. I believe we will compete. I believe we will compete because we have the greatest talent in the world right here in the United States of America. But we will compete not because we cut off our friends and allies, but because we're the best in the world and compete with our friends and allies. This is what it will take to actually get serious about decoupling from our enemy. We are entering the danger window. We are within the Davidson window for when China annexes or possibly invades Taiwan. And we cannot have the CCP and Xi Jinping holding a gun to our head as we do it. That will be the beginning of a new era where the United States of America is no longer in a leading position, but has finally consummated what China envisioned when this project began in 1990. A new equilibrium of a codependent relationship that we don't want to be in. Codependent relationships do not end well. The only question is who ends it first. The sooner we end this, the better for us. And our way of getting there starts with semiconductor independence, starting in places right here in Ohio, not with crony capitalism and begging the government with the dowries required in that marriage with the government, but instead through discipline, saying that we will do it for our national security while opening up trade and embracing competition with our allies. That is how we shore up our semiconductor supply chain and ensure that Xi Jinping will never lord over us. How we actually live our daily lives in the United States of America. And you mark my words, if we do this, I believe in 5 to 10 years, it is possible that the United States, like Taiwan does today, will lead the world in our own production of leading-edge semiconductors that we export to the rest of the world. That is what is possible if we truly believe once again in American exceptionalism. Thank you. Now, the third area where we're going to have to lead is shoring up our defense industrial base here at home. Here I'm going to lay out some sobering truths. Today, in order to produce our naval capacity, our Air Force capacity, our Department of Defense has identified 35 critical strategic materials to our military supply chain. For 16 of them, China is the leading producer. For 22 of them, the United States has no primary production in this country. Just last week, the CEO of Raytheon, a military contractor, was begging with politicians and potential policymakers, folks like myself and others, who will be leading this country, to play nice with China because they can't make F-35s. They can't make even ships or other production that we need in the United States without depending on China. Think about how little sense this makes. If we're investing in our own military and defense production capabilities, why exactly are we doing it? We're doing it to protect and prevent against, God forbid, a conflict scenario in the United States. Now, who's our top adversary today? It's not the USSR. That fell back in 1990, as some seem to forget. Our top adversary today is Communist China. So what do you think is the first thing Communist China is going to do in a scenario where we end up in a conflict with China? It's to turn off our defense industrial base, which they control, the very weapons that they don't want us to use to strike China. This is the mistake. Each Virginia-class attack submarine today requires 9,200 pounds. Every F-35 needs 920 pounds of rare earth minerals that come today from China. Our greatest adversary is also our greatest supplier of the very military equipment that we build to deter that adversary. And just to put this in context, we did not depend for one iota of our military industrial supply chain with the USSR in the last Cold War. Ronald Reagan himself would be rolling over in his grave and is today, knowing that we depend on our adversary for our own defenses. So the right answer is we have to invest in our own defense industrial base. Today I'm announcing, first of all, a commitment that I think we have to make as Americans between now and 2032, getting us through the Davidson danger window, getting us through the window where we will hit our nadir in naval capacity and otherwise. A commitment to a floor of 4% of U.S. GDP spent on military expenditures to defend our own homeland where our defense capabilities are badly lacking. And this is not going to be a military expenditure to fight foreign wars that don't advance U.S. interests. How are we going to get that money? Here's the answer. We have spent $3 trillion, over $3 trillion, in wars spanning Afghanistan to Iraq over the last 20 years that did not advance U.S. interests. Tens of thousands of American lives lost in foreign wars that did not advance American interests. To what end? 20 years later, the Taliban still in control in Afghanistan. 20 years later, a regime in Iraq that is still unfriendly to the United States, weak, vulnerable to Iranian encroachment. Just in recent weeks, Ohio's own sons and daughters in our own National Guard coming back from deployments to Iraq. Here we are 20 years later. We have to learn from our past mistakes in order to avoid repeating them. Where our military investment really needs to go is to defending our homeland itself. Cyber defense capabilities that are lacking today. Super electromagnetic pulse capabilities that are lacking today. Electromagnetic pulse attacks that could take out our electric grid in a matter of days. 60 Chinese transformers embedded into the U.S. electric grid today. Nuclear missile defense systems that are lacking in an era of hypersonic missiles. Space-based defense capabilities that are lacking in an era where China and Russia both have space-based offensive capabilities against the United States. Border defense capabilities, where we are using our own military to defend against an armed invasion across somebody else's border in Ukraine, when we were not using our own military to defend against our own southern border facing an armed invasion here at home. That is wrong. The top job of the U.S. military under my watch will once again be to defend American citizens here in the homeland. And with that, that is how we will shore up our defense industrial base and our homeland defense capabilities against our top adversary, that is communist China, evolving, as Lincoln might have called us to do, the dogmas of 1980, peace through strength, to a new vision of prosperity through peace here at home. That is the new way forward for both advancing our economic interests while advancing our national security here at home. A peace dividend by no longer fighting wars in parts of the world that do not advance our interests, to have the money to actually defend our own industrial base right here at home in the United States of America. That is how I will lead this country as your next commander-in-chief. Thank you. Now, the fourth way in which we have to secure our independence from China is from our own pharmaceutical supply chain that today depends on China for our very day-to-day health. Today, over 70% of America's supply of key pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. Over 95% of our imports for over-the-counter medicines, like ibuprofen, come from China. Now, I want to lay out for you something that everybody who's knowledgeable about this issue in Washington, D.C. knows, but has refused to say publicly because of the consequences of speaking the truth to our own people. I believe we have to speak the truth as leaders of this country, not just when it is easy, but when it is hard. Here's the truth of what's going on with the fentanyl epidemic in this country. Yes, we have fentanyl spreading like an epidemic across our country, but where's it coming from? Today, as we speak, I'm not making this up, the key synthetic precursors for making fentanyl come from, you can't make this stuff up, come from Wuhan, exported to the Mexican drug cartels at cheap prices, that are making synthetic fentanyl south of our own border with the aid, in certain cases, of Chinese chemists south of our own border. lacing fentanyl into other drugs unknowingly for the people who take them here in the United States. There are between 80 and 100,000 deaths that are going to happen in this country due to fentanyl poisoning, most of which illegally crossed the southern border, much of which was made with Chinese precursors, in what is a one-sided opium war that we fail to acknowledge actually exists. You cannot win a war if you don't recognize that you're actually in one. I'll tell you the story of two parents who I met actually in one of my travels to Iowa. I've met similar parents within a 50-mile radius of right here where we are in Ohio. In this case, it was Derek and Kathy. They lost their 17-year-old son, Sebastian, who took a Percocet that he bought via Snapchat. He shouldn't have done that. And we have a lot of fixes for social media in this country to make sure kids don't have the ability to do things like that. But he bought what he thought was Percocet on Snapchat. What he didn't know he was buying was a death sentence, because that Percocet was laced with fentanyl that likely crossed our southern border after being made from synthetic inputs coming from China. This is not an innocent accident. This is intentional. And you mark my words today. This is the part you're not supposed to say, but which is true, and we must acknowledge to get serious about decoupling our pharmaceutical supply chain with China. If we are in a conflict scenario with China, God forbid, the same country that unleashed hell on the world with a man-made virus from a lab in Wuhan, the same country that from Wuhan is sending synthetic precursors of fentanyl to Mexican drug cartels to lace other illegal pharmaceuticals with fentanyl that are killing tens of thousands of innocent American young men and women today, will be the same country that could lace our legal pharmaceutical supply chain with poison, including fentanyl as well. That is not a fate that we can abide. Yet today, that same country that unleashed hell on the world with COVID-19 with a man-made virus, that same country that's waging a one-sided, illicit opium war, lacing fentanyl into other drugs crossing the border illegally, is the same country that we depend on for 95% of our imports, for our over-the-counter medicines that we take every day. This is unacceptable. And the only way we're going to fix it is by a combination of onshoring that production here to the United States, including through radical reform of the FDA, which makes that much more difficult here in the United States than they should. That is the administrative state here at home. It is why the one war that I will wage will not be some unforeseen foreign war in the Middle East, but the war on our own administrative state here at home. Yes, we have to reform the regulations that stop pharmaceutical manufacturers from bringing that supply chain here to the United States, but it will also require, if we're being honest with ourselves, I will not sell you a fake vision of onshoring everything immediately. That's not going to happen if we're serious about decoupling from China. It will also require expanded relationships with India. And I'm not just saying that because my name's Vivek Ramaswamy, I promise. Israel, Brazil, other East Asian countries, including Japan and South Korea again, to get serious about making sure that the medicines we put in our mouth are not laced with the same poison that the Percocet that young Sebastian put in his mouth before the Chinese Communist Party played a role in killing him. And I think that that is the task ahead. This is achievable. But we can't fall into the trap of just saying that we're going to instantly onshore that. We have to have a combined, mixed strategy of onshoring it by deburdening ourselves with the FDA and other regulatory burdens, while also expanding our trade relationships with those other countries, such that our vision will be by 2032, the 30 billion doses of anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen that we take every day, we will be able to take them without having to think twice about whether we're being poisoned by our enemy for our modern way of life. See, this is the new vision for our conservative movement. A combined, honest vision that is at once trade-friendly with our allies, while also onshoring as much as we possibly can here to the United States. That's an honest approach for how we're going to actually achieve not just lip service, but actual reality here in the U.S. Now, the question I get is, do the numbers work? Are we serious about being able to actually cut the cord from China? Well, the first thing I will say is this is our moment to do it. Xi Jinping is in a weaker spot than we are if we have the courage to actually open our eyes and see it. The zero COVID policies had nothing to do with COVID. It's the Achilles heel of an autocrat. It was about power, dominion, control, and punishment. This is why China's economy is languishing today. So if we have a U.S. president who's serious about sitting across the table from Xi Jinping with a spine and actually saying with authority that unless you play by the same set of rules, unless you stop stealing our IP from our companies in forced data and technology transfers, unless you stop turning our companies into lobbying pawns, unless you actually play by the same set of rules, abiding by the same standards we agreed to, then we're cutting the cord. You will not buy land in this country. You will not donate to universities in this country. You will not turn companies into your Trojan horses. Our companies will not expand into your Chinese market. You want to know what's happened? He's going to have to fold because they're in a weaker spot than we are. But it is when you are most willing to make a sacrifice that you won't actually have to make one at all, because the numbers are on our side. Even South Korea, of the total amount of electronic exports, this is the one area they say is impossible, our reliance on China for electronics. Of South Korea's total exports in the area of electronics, the U.S. only accounts for 10% of it today. So we have capacity, both in the form of our allies as well as production here in the United States, that absolutely can fill that gap. The question is, do we have a president of the United States that has the spine to actually see it through? Take Chile. It's the third largest producer of lithium. We rely today on China for our lithium. Chile exports 8 times as much lithium to China for refining than they do to the United States today. And we have a free trade relationship with Chile today. We are lacking in some of those rare earth minerals here in the homeland, but even though 40% of those rare earth minerals come from China, 25% are enjoyed by nations like Brazil and India. So once again, this is doable. The idea that we cannot depend and that we cannot decouple from China, that it would hurt Americans here on American soil, that is a farce that we've been fed by largely Chinese-fed propaganda served up to us on a silver platter by both parties that have been lobbied effectively by the CCP. But if we see the facts, we know what's possible. And the standard I use is what young Thomas Jefferson would say if he were alive today. He's my favorite president. I can take a lot of flack for that, but that's for another day. He was 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm an old man by comparison. He invented the swivel chair while he was at it. The swivel chair that we sit on today was invented by Thomas Jefferson while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. One of the people who co-signed that with him was Benjamin Franklin, who invented right here in the United States the bifocal spectacles, one of the early remedies to the common cold. The Franklin stove that we use right here was made and invented right here in America by a co-signer of the Declaration of Independence that was written by the 33-year-old that invented and made the swivel chair while he was at it. That's what's possible in the United States. We are the pioneers. We are the explorers. This is what it means to be an American. You weren't trained in it? Great. We're going to figure it out and do it nonetheless here at home. That is the American way of life. Have we been perfect at every step in our national history, from our founding through even the mistakes that I criticized in the 1990s? No, we have not. We're not a nation of gods. We're a nation of men. But we're a nation still founded on those ideals. And I would rather live in a country that has ideals and falls short of them, and that they will call a hypocrite for that, than a country that no longer has ideals at all. Nobody calls China a hypocrite, because to be a hypocrite, you had to have the ideals in the first place. But our worst hypocrisies, and even our worst mistakes, even the ones I have criticized today, our worst mistakes and our worst hypocrisies are still our best evidence that we still have those ideals in the first place. America is not founded on perfection. We are founded on the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. That is the dream that won the American Revolution. That is the dream that reunited us after the Civil War. That is the dream that won us 2 world wars and the Cold War. That is the dream that still gives hope to the free world today. And if we can revive that dream of Thomas Jefferson from 1776, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus is going to defeat us. That is what American exceptionalism is all about. And that is what we together will revive to save this great nation. Thank you all for coming today. May God bless you. God bless your families. And may God bless our United States of America. Thank you. Thank you.